This is the Big Breakdown, a long look back at some of the biggest stories we're covering for you at the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. This is Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Here now, Tony Brueski.
If you've been following the Delphi investigation, if you're new to the Delphi investigation, this whole story, you're going, what is going on here? This is a video you are going to want to pay attention to. This is a video where we're going to walk you down a path of an alternative suspect, although in reality it feels a lot more like Richard Allen should have been the alternative suspect, or not a suspect at all. When you look at the mountain of evidence that we're about to sift through, of just one of many individuals that may have been involved in some way, shape, or form in this case. Not saying murderer, but I'm saying involved, because this story we're about to tackle, the individual that we're about to discuss, we know they were involved. That's not even up for debate. Involved in communicating with a minor, one of the murdered little girls, communicating directly with this man right up until the point of her death. Communicating so much so. Talk of even meeting at the place where she died. The day of. But that, according to Delphi investigators, is not evidence. That is not, it's not solid. I mean, what the odds are on something like that? You have convicted child SAer or predator, or I should be correct here in this, because it's not an SA charge that Kegan Kline has been charged with. It's possessing and distributing CSAM material. Actively communicating with one of the girls up until the day she dies. Talking about meeting up at the place where they die. And some of this person is not connected to the actual murders. What are the odds of those creepy ships passing in the night? There are moments in criminal investigations where the paperwork tells a story. Officials won't. You sift through enough affidavits, enough warrants, enough forensic timelines, and eventually the subtext starts screaming louder than the public statements ever did. And that's exactly what happens when you sit down with the probable cause affidavit that's tied to Kegan Anthony Kline, the man behind the Anthony Shots screen name account. The catfish persona that communicated with Liberty German in the hours before she and Abigail Williams were murdered on that bridge in Delphi. If you're not already watching us on YouTube, I want to hear your opinion, and YouTube is a place where you can air it in our comment section on the video. So if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, on whatever, Spotify, iHeart, awesome. Thank you. Please hit subscribe there, but also please do check out our YouTube channel. Just search Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. That's where you'll find it. And you can find this video, same title and everything, and weigh in. We do read all of the comments, and we try to respond to as many as we can. So you read the affidavit, and suddenly the quiet parts aren't so quiet anymore. Suddenly you see an outline. An outline of a digital predator operating in the same time, the same region, using the same tactics, and talking to the same girl whose phone captured the final moments of her life. It doesn't prove who killed Libby and Abby. Nothing here really does, but it shows exactly why. Less than 2 weeks after the murders, the FBI and Indiana State Police stormed a little house in Peru, Indiana, because they believed the man behind that account knew something. Not because he fit a sketch, not because they found his DNA, but because his digital fingerprints were all over the last known communications of a murdered child. And the affidavit tells a story even if it never actually uses the word Delphi. When the Delphi murders happened, the world saw a grainy still frame of a man on a bridge and heard a 3-second recording of "Down the Hill." That was the face of the case. That was the anchor. And for a long time, that was the entire narrative. Catch the guy who walked behind the girls. As if that really means anything. On a busy trail, on a nice warm day, unseasonably warm day, this guy caught randomly somehow is magically the murderer. Keep telling everybody that's the guy and they'll believe it. We have no evidence to think that's the guy or say that's the guy. But if we just keep saying that's the guy, it makes us look like we got some guy because we currently don't have any guy. And we're screwing up these solid leads that we do have to a guy. But quietly in the background, there was another investigation happening, one that almost no one talked about. A digital lead that didn't come with a dramatic footage or iconic images. A lead that existed on Instagram and Snapchat, buried behind a handsome model's stolen photo and a username that sounded harmless. Anthony Shots. This affidavit is the roadmap to that hidden side of the investigation. It's not flashy, it's not sensational, but if you want to understand why police were inside the Kline home just 12 days after the murders, this is where your answers come from. It's a digital autopsy of a predator's devices, and it's the connective tissue between the catfish account and the Delphi girls. And there's a lot of questions here because when you realize that within 12 days they knew this guy was dealing in CSAM material, why the F did it take 3 years to actually arrest him and charge him with anything? Not related to this crime. You're communicating with the girls. You have this material. You're good. Why are you running away from this suspect that has, like, he's glowing? There's a spotlight. Look, this is horrible looking. This is almost like slam dunkish type material. No, it's good. It's good. Why would you walk away from that? Does he know something else? Does he have information about you? About people closer to the case? Something people don't want to have come out? Well, multiple people involved in this case? That people have a vested interest in not having a light shown on because it happens to intermingle in the shady side of the world across the dark side of the tracks where Anthony Shots exists. And that would directly contradict the world where maybe people on the other side of the tracks, supposed good guys, live. Is there too much overlap here? Is somebody dipping their toe in the cesspool over there? Or diving in or swimming or hanging out in the cesspool hot tub on the weekends? And you don't want that coming out. I don't know. Pure speculation. But when you don't have answers as to how the hell this was all just... your mind starts to wonder. I'm not accusing anybody. I'm asking questions. Because the truth is this. The first major action police took in the Delphi case was not on the bridge. It was Kegan Kline's phone. On February 13th of 2017, 2 girls go missing on the hiking trail. February 14th, their bodies are found. February 25th, ISP and the FBI raid Kegan Kline's home. 12 days. 12 days from the murder scene to search warrant. You know how rare that is in a case without a suspect description, without a vehicle, without DNA back yet, without any identified adult men seen with the girls? It doesn't happen unless law enforcement has something incredibly specific. And they did! Inside the affidavit, the reason becomes clear. Police had traced the Anthony Schatz account, the last online account to communicate with Liberty German, back to this house, back to this exact home, back to this exact IP address, back to this exact man. How would he not be charged and arrested? Yeah, good question. That was not a coincidence. It wasn't a hunch. It was a digital trail. Instagram, Snapchat, Comcast, IP logs, subpoenas, all arrows pointing to the Kline home. The affidavit doesn't say Delphi, but the timeline does. The urgency does. The fact that the FBI showed up in person does. The fact that Kegan was polygraphed that same day does. You don't get that response unless the person behind that account was connected to something far more serious than catfishing. According to the affidavit, the Anthony Schatz account was created in the summer of 2016, July 14th for Snapchat, July 20th for Instagram. The profile used images of a handsome, wealthy male model. Stolen, of course, because Kegan Kline is a large, oafy-looking buffoon that looks like he probably eats, pretty much a walk-in cooler of McDonald's spoiled items on a daily basis while looking at CSAM material. That's putting it nicely. It's built around a fantasy persona designed specifically to attract the attention of young teenage girls. Because to be completely honest, I don't know that Anthony Schatz could attract a mangy raccoon to find him attractive. A 22-year-old man pretending to be glamorous, chiseled, high school boy. The affidavit lays out Kegan's own confession. He made the account. He used it to talk to minors. He knew their ages. He didn't care. He moved girls from Instagram to Snapchat because the messages disappeared. He asked for pictures, and he saved those pictures, hundreds of them. And he admitted to, well, with them. Lovely guy, the type you'd trust to date your daughter. This was not occasional behavior. This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, repeated, and deliberate. And this pattern, the exact digital grooming pattern, which is what matched the communication style of Anthony Schatz, used with Liberty German. Find girl, compliment girl, escalate chat, move platforms, ask age, ignore answers, request photo, request location, request a meetup. The affidavit spells out this entire blueprint, step by step. This wasn't something or someone dabbling. This was someone hunting. And this is where the outline tightens. This is where the story inside the affidavit intersects with the story unfolding in Delphi, because everything the affidavit shows, the MO, the grooming, the escalation, the insistence on Snapchat, the request for location, the disregard for age, all of it lines up with what the public later learned was happening on Libby's phone. Investigators confirmed years later, Liberty German communicated with the Anthony Schatz account shortly before her murder. And when you compare the affidavit to the Delphi timeline, the parallels are stunning. Libby was talking to a boy who wasn't a boy, talking to a persona that Kegan admits he created, engaging in a conversation designed to move her to Snapchat, engaging in a conversation where the other party attempts to meet her. Nothing in the affidavit says Kegan met Libby. Nothing says he harmed her. Nothing puts him on the bridge, but the digital fingerprints are undeniable. The account she spoke with was his. And that is why police were in his living room 12 days after the murders. When police executed the warrant, they didn't just take one phone. They took 6 devices, an entire ecosystem of child exploitation, iPhones, Androids, a tablet, iPod Touch, every single one of them containing evidence, hundreds of images, some allegedly as young as 3 years old. Yeah. If you're in prison right now with this piece of shit and you got nothing to lose, I'm not saying, I'm just saying. That's a lot of extra breath that's taking up space in those cells. I can't imagine it smells good. Videos, screenshots, cloud links, save files from Snapchat, save files from Kik, save files from Meet Me, chats where he used multiple fake personas, including pretending to be his own stepsister. It was a factory of exploitation, and that's not hyperbole. The affidavit lists file after file after file, practically a catalog of criminal evidence. This is the part most people never hear about because it gets overshadowed by the Delphi story. But to understand why people stayed locked on to Kline for years, you have to understand the scale of what they found. This wasn't a couple illegal images. This was a man who built an empire of deception to manipulate and exploit children. And that's exactly the type of digital predator who would try to get a girl alone at a park or a trail, which is precisely what Anthony Schott's account attempted to do with Libby. Shocker, eh? The timeline inside the affidavit is brutal in its precision. 12:30 p.m., search warrant executed. 12:35, Kegan's father interviewed. 1:25 p. Kegan interviewed afternoon. Kegan admits to catfishing, grooming, soliciting. Evening, Kegan polygraphed. 7:30, polygraph ends. Night, Kegan taken home. This was not routine. This was an emergency. You don't polygraph CSAM suspects the same day unless there's another critical issue tied to the same device. They weren't worried about Kik messages from 6 months ago. They were worried about the girl he had talked to 12 days ago. That is why you see the urgency, the speed, the sequencing. This was the digital side of the Delphi investigation in real time. And then comes the moment that seals why investigators stayed on him. A guilty person panics when police show up. A person with nothing to hide does not go home after hours of interrogation and immediately begin surgically deleting every piece of evidence that ties them to a teenage girl they were talking to. Yet that's exactly what Kegan did. According to the affidavit at 9:19 p.m., Snapchat deleted, 10:14, Instagram deleted, next day Meet Me deleted, then reinstalled, then deleted again, then browser history wiped, the entire data caches cleared. This didn't happen over the course of 2 weeks. This wasn't sloppy panic. This was precision, methodical destruction of the exact apps he used to talk to hundreds of minors. And all of this started hours after police asked him about communications tied to the Delphi murders. This is not proof that he harmed Libby or Abby, but it is undeniable proof that he feared the evidence on that phone. When someone destroys evidence this aggressively and this quickly, it is because that evidence is relevant to something far bigger than what they admitted to. The affidavit reveals something else, something that always gets overshadowed, but should definitely not be ignored. This is a big piece of this story. Kegan had a go bag packed to leave Indiana. He had plans to flee while his father slept. He had a second bag packed for Las Vegas. And according to his own statements, he had already traveled there shortly after the murders and returned home the day police stormed his house. That trip has never been fully explained. He said he wanted to get away. He said he was scared. He said he was effed and should have left. Why would you be any of those things if you have absolutely nothing to do with this crime? And maybe that's all it was, panic. But panic about what? The affidavit makes it very clear what he knew he'd done, grooming minors, soliciting images, but he'd been doing that for years. That behavior alone wouldn't trigger this level of panic. Yet suddenly, weeks after the murders, he's ready to leave the state in the middle of the night? Again, not proof of involvement, but proof of fear. Fear of what investigators would find? Fear of what they were looking for? Fear that his online communications were tied to a crime bigger than the ones he was admitting to? After analyzing the evidence, the affidavit shows a man whose digital behavior perfectly matches what investigators later said happened to Libby. He groomed. He lied about his identity. He pushed teens to Snapchat. He collected images of them, unclothed like trophies. He asked girls to meet him. He asked where they were, who they were with. He targeted Indiana minors repeatedly. He geolocated content from towns all over the region. Everything he did online fits the same patterns the Anthony Schatz persona used with Liberty German. And while nothing in the affidavit ties him to the physical crime scene, the digital overlap is significant enough that police acted on it immediately and reacted on it again years later. Here's the part that makes no sense. And I touched on it a little bit earlier. But this really matters. Because this is a weird deviation of behavior. Okay, you're on him. The investigators are on him. This looks promising. This looks like it might be something. Here's the part that makes no sense. Unless the Delphi case was involved. After all of this, the confession, the forensics, the images, the admissions, the deleted apps, police walked away and did nothing for 3 full years. You mean he wasn't arrested immediately on these other charges of having this material and at least held or charged with that? Nope. Let's spell this out a little bit. In February of 2017, police had a full confession, hundreds of CSAM images, videos, screenshots, chats, forensic logs, IP addresses, Kegan's own statements, multiple devices loaded with evidence, location-based images, contact with victims, his destruction of evidence, his attempted flight. This is the kind of case prosecutors sit on? This is the kind of case investigators ignore? Huh? No, this is not that. This is not the type of case a prosecutor should sit on. This is not the kind of case investigators ignore. This is not the kind of case that waits. But it did. It did. CSAM charges typically get filed fast, very fast, because children are involved, because distribution is involved, because possession is involved, because these cases are slam dunks, and yet, nothing. No charges until 2020. I would love to hear the reasoning why. I would love to understand and learn why there were no charges against the guy that you got dead to rights on CSAM charges. Waits 3 years. I know no one has ever asked you that. I don't know, maybe too much Botox to someone's head that they couldn't think, this might be a viable question. But you don't want to ask those tough questions when you want to get super close to people. 3 years of silence, 3 years of a confessed predator walking free. You can't ignore that timeline. You can't explain it away as paperwork delay. There is no 3-year paperwork delay on a case involving hundreds of images of children, some as young as 3 years old. So what does the affidavit show? That the case was dormant until April of 2020, when suddenly the case is reassigned. Forensic meetings begin, surveillance starts, charges are prepared, police publicly re-announce an Anthony Schatz connection. Everything reactivates all at once when Delphi investigators overhaul their digital review. Is that proof of anything? No. But is the kind of coincidence that deserves scrutiny? Yeah. The only major active case connected to Kline in 2017 was Delphi. So the only logical explanation for a delay this long is that he was tied to something bigger than CSAM. Again, not guilt, not involvement in the murders per se, Just a fact. Police treated him differently than any other CSAM suspect in the state. And the affidavit lays out exactly why. By the time you reach the end of the document, one truth becomes obvious. This affidavit is not about a random child exploitation case. This is the digital backbone of the Delphi investigation. It doesn't accuse Kegan of murder. It doesn't place him at the crime scene. It doesn't say he met the girls, but it does say he was the catfish. He was the one who talked to Libby. He was contacted because of the murders. He destroyed evidence afterwards. He fled the state. He groomed minors aggressively. He created the persona that lured Libby. He was searched specifically because of the Delphi timeline. His arrest was delayed under circumstances that make sense only if investigators were holding him open as part of a much larger case. And none of that came from rumor, speculation, or conspiracy. It came straight from the affidavit. So what in the holy hell is going on here? When people ask, how is Kegan Kline connected to the Delphi girls, the affidavit is the answer. Not because it proves guilt, not because it proves involvement, but it shows in stunning detail he was the man behind the digital mask. He was the one talking to Libby. He was the reason the FBI kicked down his door. He was the one deleting evidence the moment police dropped him off. And he was the predator operating in their social media orbit at the exact moment they were murdered. And oh yeah, the local Delphi investigators fired the FBI from the case. You didn't know they could do that? They can do that. Although, depending on the investigator you talk to, one says, so-and-so fired it. The other's like, I have no idea. Those girls deserve better. Those families deserve better. Those families that the investigators convinced, we got our guy. It's the CVS worker who has really no documented history, but it couldn't possibly be these monsters that we've already knocked down their doors of. Got too close to the sun and quickly flew back away from, because that's what that looks like. It's why, what? In an investigation that has always felt split between the physical world and the digital one, this document is the missing link between the two. It explains the urgency, it explains the early moves, it explains the later revisits, and it explains the 3-year investigative silence in a way that no press conference ever has. Still leaving thousands of questions. The affidavit doesn't solve Delphi, but it does something almost as important. It shows you why investigators believed that whoever killed those girls didn't operate in isolation. When they were seriously looking at the case, when they were seriously investigating it initially, someone somewhere was already talking to at least one of the girls. And that someone was using the name Anthony Schatz. And the man behind that account was named Kegan Anthony Kline. So why, when you get so close to some of these very questionable characters with such damning evidence around them, why do you suddenly walk away? Especially if it shows involvement of multiple people. Pure speculation. But I'm going to guess one of those multiple people within this orbit of Kegan Kline and several others is someone you won't expect. Someone who has a much more vested interest in not having their identity known, of being involved with this sort of activity. Who that is, why that is, I do not know the answer to. When you get the good guys crossing the tracks over to the bad guys, and you look, this is human nature. In any ecosystem, you're going to inevitably have some of that going on. As far as how bad it gets when somebody crosses the tracks to the other side, is up to each individual that we're talking about in each individual case. But people do that sort of thing, and they don't want to get caught. And if they have power, money, influence, and they see, this could accidentally shine a light over here on me, and I might not have anything to do with, per se, these girls, or maybe you do. And I'm not talking about Kegan. But you see that path that you thought no one was traveling on except you and your creepy buddies. And suddenly there's a giant spotlight there and hundreds of people with microphones going, why are you following this path? You turn around pretty quick. Why did they turn around pretty quick? That is the question. Give me your thoughts in the comment section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. You will find a lot on this case there. We've been following it for years, and we're going to keep following it until the truth in this case is revealed. Because the truth, the answer to this, it's still hiding. It's still in the darkness. And justice has not yet been delivered for Abby and Libby. If you're interested in that, please do press subscribe and weigh in with your thoughts. Until next time, my name is Tony Brueski. We will talk again real.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Brueski and the Hidden Killers podcast.
What'd they say?
This is Hidden Killers Live with Tony Brueski, Stacey Cole, and Todd Michaels.
Today we are diving straight into the Delphi case, part of the Delphi case that's been hiding in plain sight for years, hiding if you want to call it that, the depositions, the filings, the sworn testimony, and the internal investigative record that was never part of the polished public narrative. And I'm going to say this bluntly because there's no other way to say it. The picture these depositions paint is not one of a cohesive investigation that followed the evidence. It's the picture of an investigation fighting itself, contradicting itself, and stumbling through major decisions as if no one was steering the helm. We're not talking about minor mistakes. We're talking about the FBI possibly being kicked out or not, depending on which investigator you ask. We're talking about the Behavioral Analysis Unit setting up a flare about Nordic beliefs, ritualistic staging, symbolic indicators, only for the entire assessment to vanish from the internal record. We're talking about witness statements reshaped into something unrecognizable. When they hit the search warrant affidavit, we're talking about major leads in this case on possible third-party suspects just brushed aside with no further action. Even after bizarre self-incriminating statements, we're talking about sticks left at the crime scene for days, a bullet with zero field documentation, and experts brought in 7 years too late to analyze photographs instead of evidence. This isn't fringe speculation. These aren't internet fantasies. This is what investigators themselves said under oath in black and white. And the only question now is what any of this means for Richard Allen, for the appeal, and for the integrity of the case itself. Here to help us dissect all of this, Bob Mata, host of the podcast Defense Diaries. Bob, let's dive into this shit show as it continues along. The shit tracks. 2 lead investigators, 2 opposite sworn statements about whether the FBI was removed from the case. One says they were kicked out. The other says, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, just take us into this cesspool of confusion.
Yeah, so what we're talking about in terms of the new evidence, if you out there in the audience aren't aware, during the case itself actually pre-trial, but before any hearings were conducted, there was this thing called a Franks motion that was filed by the defense, and the Franks motion is essentially saying, in layperson's terms, that when they went in to get the warrant, the arrest warrant and or the search warrant, that there were misrepresentations or omissions that were made, or straight up lies that were made by law enforcement in order to secure that particular warrant. Okay, so the defense filed it. It's a massive filing. It was like 136 pages. And with that, there was a ton of exhibits that were attached. Okay, so once that thing was resolved, if you want to call it that, even though there was never actually a hearing on it, but she did have a hearing on the third-party culprit stuff, which is kind of where the Franks memo lived in terms of the information that it put out to the public. Ultimately, what ends up happening is that Allen's convicted, and there's an appeal being processed right now. They're preparing the appellate briefs, and Allen's appellate lawyers are saying, look, we don't have the exhibits for this huge Franks memo. We need them. Because for whatever reason, the clerk, Jody Williams, who happens to be Judge Gull's clerk, didn't supply those exhibits along with the record when she prepared it for the appeal. Okay. So the defense appellate attorneys go and say, hey, we need these, you need these. We need them to prepare the brief, and you, the appellate court, need them so that you have a complete record in front of you. And at that point, the appellate court turns around and says, okay, here's the deal. We've been asking you to get the record complete so that we can move along with this appeal. And they gave Williams and Gull 20 days to get the thing on record. Okay. To perfect the appellate record. So that's what dropped. So they're not new in the sense like it's unearthed evidence that came out of nowhere. It's the evidence, as the defense sees it, that was attached as exhibits to the Franks memo. However, in terms of us seeing it, the public, it's all new. So we didn't see all this stuff. So we're kind of getting a peek behind the curtain. We're kind of getting a vision of what the defense was seeing when they started digging into things. And, there's just a lot of shocking stuff out there. And starting with kind of your first point, Tony, with, why were the feds disposed of in this case? And I'll tell you, Doug Carter got on the stand, and he testified to it at trial that he told the FBI, no, we're good. Thanks, but no thank.
Can you just turn them away like that? Can you just go, get lost, buddy. It's not your jurisdiction.
Yeah. Apparently, because he did. They dipped out of the case.
Why would you?
Manpower.
Why would you? And how common is that to have happen? Especially when you're talking about, and maybe it's more common than I'm aware of. When we're talking a smaller jurisdiction here like Delphi, they don't have a lot of resources. So the FBI being like, "Hey, we're going to help you. We can really dig in here. We can give you these resources that you don't have." How common is it that small jurisdictions turn that sort of thing away? Maybe it is for the wrong reasons, which I feel like it is here, and. Why did they do that in this case?
Well, it's kind of like that question of why does it seem like they're protecting a pedophile in Spencer? There is no good answer, and the only answer that you can come up with is nefarious. Yeah, like you're talking about the Unified Command, which is this little, kind of internal investigation team that they put together, which was comprised of a bunch of guys that had never investigated anything like this. like nothing. Like
with the title Unified Command.
Unified Command. Yeah. So ultimately they end
Unified.
Thanks, Todd.
That's me.
Oh, thanks, Tone. Ultimately why they did it is inexplicable. You're talking about the feds, who are obviously going to have way more experience. They're going to have way more resources. They're going to have way better technology. Like, why you wouldn't want them involved if they're willing to do it is inexplicable to me. You know, and this is deeper into the investigation. I think it's in like 2019. It's like 2 years in, you know, so I wish I had a better answer. I simply don't know. And I cannot think of a good reason as to why. You know, it's like you're talking about these guys. I don't want to call them a bunch of Barney Fifes, but to me, from the outside looking in, they look like a bunch of Barney Fifes.
I was just going to ask about that, because are all cases as confusing and jumbled behind the scenes, and maybe we just don't see it, and when it all comes out into trial, it is a nice, neat package? Are they this disorganized behind the scenes all the time, or is this a extraordinary case?
No, well, I think that, you know, you're dealing with human beings, and human beings make mistakes, and you know, you're going to have cops when you've got multiple, especially if there's multiple agencies involved. You know, you're going to have individuals that have their own thoughts on the case. They're going to have ideas that the investigation should go one way, and another guy's going to say, well, I don't think that's it. And if that guy ranks higher than the guy who thinks it should go one way, that guy who's the lower ranking guy, his theory of the way the investigation should go is not going to be adhered to, and it's not going to be taken seriously, which is exactly what happened here. You know, I happen to be friends with one of the guys who was originally on this case as an investigator with the Carroll County Sheriff's Department, and he was a high-ranking deputy sheriff in there. And, you know, he was a guy who had said, look, I think this is like, we're over our skis on this one. Like we need help. We need help from qualified agencies that have done this type of investigation before, because we're going to fuck it up. And ultimately he ends up leaving the sheriff's department. Whether it was by hook or by crook is hard to know. He ended up suing, and I think there was a settlement, but, you know, he was very much of the mindset that they needed help, because they just could not do this because they weren't equipped and they didn't have the experience to do it. So in that case, you know, I mean,
that's a big piece of this. Like right at the beginning, you have that sort of behavior going on. You have someone saying exactly what you just said. We're in over our heads on this. We need a little bit of help. Well, we don't. And however that went down, it ends in a lawsuit, and he leaves. Obviously, it probably had something to do with this. At least that would be the tea leaves if we're going to read them, in my opinion. So you have this already. We see this track record of, are these blinders that these guys had on in this case? Because this is the thing that we always look at in here, and now that we're seeing some of these depositions and such, we're always trying to figure out, is it incompetence or is there something trying to be covered up here? Because the two can look very, very similar. Incompetence quite often can look very nefarious, but sometimes people are just not the brightest, or they're just not that experienced. They don't have reps in a certain area, and what they may think they should do turns out to be probably the worst idea imaginable. When you started looking at some of these depositions, Bob, what was your takeaway? What were some of the key pieces that had stood out to you?
I mean, really, Jerry Holman's was probably the most disturbing, you know, and Jerry Holman was really the lead dude on this thing. You know, I mean, if anybody's watched any of the Allen interrogations, and there's two of them, you know, it's Jerry Holman that's the cop who's interrogating him in the second one, which is, you know, the more disturbing of the two, and that is ultimately where, you know, Rick Allen, after that interview, never saw the light of day again. You know, he was taken into custody, and he never left that police department. When they were told to come over to that police department, or the guys that they were coming to pick up their car that they had taken to, you know, process. So, he ends up going there. But, you know, the Holman thing to me is just unbelievable.
What, you know, go into that for those who haven't seen the deposition. Just give us your synopsis of it.
I mean, to me, you're hearing from a cop who's essentially, in a nutshell, Tony, talking out of both sides of his mouth. You know, and it's, you know, because they're asking him specific questions, and I think Baldwin was the one doing the questioning, but it could have been Rosie. I can't remember at this point. But, it's just like they're really kind of diving into the investigation. And what becomes apparent throughout this deposition is that they really had no idea. They initially, and for a long, long time, they believed that this was multiple people had committed this crime, and then they didn't. And, in terms of the questioning about the third party culprit stuff, it's just, it's hard to pinpoint one thing without having me without me having it in front of me. Yeah. But like the whole thing, just the way that it reads, you really get an idea that, they really did nail a square peg into a round hole in terms of Richard Allen in this case. Once they landed on him as the guy, and once they decided, okay, well, he put himself out there, and we got this unspent casing that we think that we'll be able to go into court and say matches his weapon. That's as good as it's going to get for us. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, that's how this thing felt all along to me, and when we start getting into the exhibits with this Franks thing, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it more, but when you look at the things that three very qualified cops, longtime cops that continue to investigate, and we're talking about Ferenczi, Click, and Murphy, the guys who were continuing kind of on the Norse paganism type theme that this, was something that was going on. And you look at what the evidence that they developed. And, for Holman and his depth to be saying, well, Holder had an alibi. He has an alibi for a time frame that you're claiming that you think this time that the crimes took place. You know what I mean? Like, the kidnapping of the girls could have taken place at one time, and the homicides could have taken place at any time prior to when they're discovered the next day. So, for them to be acting as if it all happened contemporaneously, they're kidnapped. As soon as they get down there, they cross this river. They're all soaking wet. It's, 3.5 feet high. Allen, who's 5'4", 5'5", would be, up to his high chest, somehow controlling two girls. He gets over there and then kills them both. And that all happens kind of like one thing after another. Doesn't seem to make much sense to me.
No, I mean, it's almost like if it were to be, you watch like a situation comedy, and sometimes they get the piano music moving, and then it turns into this very, funny physical comedy routine that goes on for, an extended period of time. You're like, that's all. I mean, this is a horrible situation, but that's almost what you'd be talking about. Is just like, oh, and this and then it's like all improv to work this certain way, and it's going to do this. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
it just doesn't make any sort of logical sense. What's your take here? Because the thing that was talked about early on, and then obviously it never got it into the trial, is the Odinism. And when we first heard about it way back, I remember it. We're like, what the hell? Huh? Is this real? But this is actually something the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit brought into the picture we're learning about. The behavioral analysis isn't just like kind of like, well, let's spin the magic 8 ball. Let's see here. Odinism today is what we got. Looks like, kids, it might be Odinism. No, I mean, they looked into this. They found experts to talk to. There's actually quite a bit, as crazy as this shit sounds. There's quite a bit of evidence that points to at least somebody or some peoples are into this over there. It may not be quite eyes wide shut level shit, but somebody likes to do some of this stuff in some way, shape, or form, and they're practicing it in some way, shapes, or forms. At least that's what it appears.
Yeah, without question. And, if you were able to go back in a time machine, if you're the defense, in terms of making sure that the wording was more carefully put out to the public in terms of what they thought might have occurred here. I think that when they kind of worded that it was a ritual sacrifice, that was a thing that I think made people go to the place like, okay, well, that's fucking crazy.
You went to like satanic panic.
Right, because it didn't have to be that. And I don't think that it was that. I think it's exactly what you said, that you may have had a couple, 2-3 guys that were into this kind of shit, and that for whatever reason the homicides took place, that it wasn't because of a sacrifice to the gods, but that it, whatever it was, whatever the true motive was, and that part of their belief system is what accounts for the fact that they left these sticks in this, in these particular arrangements. You know what I'm saying? So because it's a whole different thing to think that they went out there and with the express intent goal of finding 2 girls and they're going to sacrifice them for a specific religious purpose, whereas whatever may have happened here, whatever the true motive was, that they're basically just going out there, and then once the deed was done, in terms of what kind of their belief system is, that they decide, okay, well, maybe we feel bad about it, maybe we're whatever the case may be, whatever their thought process is, which is really why the defense's expert Perlmutter, who didn't get to testify at trial, was really fascinating, because cops, and one of the things that she was explaining is that cops are not taught to investigate in kind of, with a magical thought process. And I know that that's kind of a corny sounding thing, but magical thought is like in real world application. If you pray, to
magical thinking.
Magical thinking. And you pray and you're hoping that prayer is going to come true. That's magical thought. So it's not necessarily magic like wizards and shit. Right. It's just thinking that something out there. So, and everybody has their own conception of what that is personally. You know what I'm saying? So, but cops aren't trained to think in that way in terms of when they're looking at a crime scene. So when they brought the BAU in, they're looking at it and they're like, okay, this is unusual, which was enough for them to think, okay, yeah, this does have some elements of what appears to be Norse paganism. Like there's some Odinism type, like the runes, what appear to be runes are clearly something that we think that this could be a part of it. I mean, if you watched the first season of True Detective, I mean, which I think was out right around the same fucking time. Like, it had that kind of vibe to it.
Yeah.
So ultimately I'm going to trust the BAU more than I'm going to trust Unified Command in terms of what their initial assessment was.
Yeah. Unified Command.
The Unified Command. So, again, everything goes back to why are they kicking the feds out of the party? It always goes back to that question for me. And, there's the entire thing with the Purdue professor, Turco, which, again, if you followed the case, you're aware that when the defense uncovered all these different things that were stuck randomly in the 15 terabytes of discovery, so as to hide them, like they weren't in one cohesive package, like, oh, here's the Odinism stuff, all in one nice, neat package. It was all stuck around like needles in a haystack. So when they end up uncovering these things piecemeal, and they start looking at it and they're like, holy shit, what is going on here? And like, why did this thing go away? Why did this leg of the investigation dry up? And ultimately you can't help but wonder exactly why that took place. Because when they then go, because initially Unified Command's like, okay, there is something weird about this scene. So they go to this Purdue professor, who this is his field. And they say, okay, here's the crime scene photos, man. Like, did you notice anything strange about this? And he's like, well, it certainly seems to have, some telltale signs of what looks to be some kind of Norse paganism ideology going on. He's like, I'm certainly I'm not going to say that it doesn't. So you've got this Purdue professor who they then, when they decide that they're going to take a different path, Okay, they disappear that guy, at least in terms of him being any part of the investigation or that they consulted with him. So when the defense is asking, hey, who was this Purdue professor that you went to? And that's the whole thing where they're playing the game. Oh, we don't know. We forget what his name was.
Right.
Like the whole thing. And then ultimately there's emails going back between Baldwin, who's one of the defense attorneys, and McClelland, who's the prosecutor. And McClelland's telling him, oh, yeah, I asked those guys and they're kind of the mindset that we'll never be able to figure it out who this guy was. And, so ultimately the defense keeps pressuring them on this point. And look, dude, like there's not going to be that many people at Purdue that are professors that are in that department that are going to be teaching this kind of shit. They were going to figure out who the fuck it was. Yeah. Right. I mean, the defense investigator would eventually have gone over there and said, okay, which one of you guys talked to Unified Command? Which one of you guys talked to the Carroll County Sheriff's Department? Like who? And out of the 3 people in that department, one of them said, oh yeah, it was me. So like ultimately, McClelland's still sending out emails saying that they're not going to know. And then the interim, they end up finding out through Holman's deposition that they knew who it was and they had told McClelland. So it's
Surprise.
like, just like the kind of shit that was going on is all the thing that happens, like all the things that happen that make you doubt this conviction so vehemently, I mean, for me at least.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Brueski and the Hidden Killers podcast.